Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Darren Newman, advisor to the Vice President of Operations at the Caribbean Development Bank. It is with great pleasure that I introduce my colleague, Mr. Daniel Best, who is the Director of the Projects Department at the Caribbean Development Bank, to deliver some brief welcome and opening remarks this morning. Mr. Best leads the bank's investment, lending, and grant portfolio. Prior to joining the bank, Mr. Best was the regional project manager for First Caribbean International University of Durham. I now hand over to Mr. Best. Thank you.
Can't hear.
Government of Antigua and Barbuda. Honorable Gail Teixeira, Minister of Parliamentary Affairs and Governance and Chief Whip, Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Mr. Julian Robinson, Member of Parliament, Chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, Government of Jamaica. Other presiding officers and other honorable members from CDB's borrowing member countries. Dr. Rick Steppenhurst, Professor, School of Continuing Studies, McGill University, Canada. Youth representatives, management and staff of the Parliament offices and of CDB and CARICAD, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the third and final event in the webinar series as part of the Public Expenditure Scrutiny for MPs, regional project funded by the Caribbean Development Bank. Today's webinar on public service, ethos, and a national integrity system brings to a close a series of rich discussions and information sharing led mainly by parliamentarians from across the region. CDB values this opportunity to engage closely with parliamentarians and the offices of Parliament, which would not have been possible without your avid interest and valuable interactions over the past 3 months. Several of you have joined us for all three events. We began in September with a focus on the parliamentary oversight of the national budget, its role in protecting the integrity of our democracies, and research on the positive impacts of Parliament's oversight on standard of living, stability, public trust, and satisfaction with democracy. After a very well-attended event, the second webinar in October facilitated sharing of experiences and good practices of parliaments using its lawmaking and oversight powers to focus governments in establishing pro-poor, inclusive, gender-responsive budgets that should lead to leaving no one behind. The role of parliaments in bringing the concerns of local people to the political arena and creating opportunities for them to speak for themselves was reinforced with some very strong examples from parliamentarians. Lastly, the series culminates today with the exchanging of information by another group of parliamentarians from across the region on the importance of integrity management and ethical oversight in carrying out expenditure scrutiny and other critical parliamentary duties. However, while the series closes, we would like to sustain this engagement with you on systems of good governance that lead to better development outcomes. We have taken note of the topics of interest that many of you shared at the end of the last two webinars, several of which indicate a strong commitment to strengthening systems of governance. We are the only development bank with a principal focus on the Caribbean. And for over 50 years, we have worked together to strengthen social and economic infrastructure and other areas critical to ensuring optimal efficiency and improving outcomes and developmental impacts. We recognize and deeply appreciate the trust that you have placed in the bank, our regional institution. Your roles and duties such as scrutinizing new legislation, making laws, debating public policy, examining forthcoming budgets and government expenditure goes to the heart of our shared commitment to transform lives in the region. We all agree that a paradigm shift is needed as we navigate through ongoing challenges. Collectively, we must meet these challenges, and promoting good governance is at the core. I wish to thank the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, CARICAD, and Dodds Group Limited for again helping with the staging of another webinar. Our sincere appreciation to the speakers and all who have joined this forum today. In closing, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for this event, Ms. Roberta Clark, who was only this month elected as Commissioner Designate to the Inter-American Committee on Human Rights. Our congratulations to her. An activist for social justice and gender equality, Roberta Clark is the Chair, Executive Committee, International Commission of Jurists, Chair, Harassment Committee of the Caribbean Court of Justice, and President of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Clark has led UN Women Regional Offices in East and Southern Africa, Libya, Asia Pacific, and the Caribbean. She is an attorney at law. Prior to her career at the United Nations, she practiced as a lawyer in Trinidad and Tobago. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a most stimulating session. I now hand over to Ms. Roberta Clark. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Best, for that warm welcome and generous introduction. And I join you in welcoming all online to the third seminar in this Public Expenditure Scrutiny webinar series hosted by the Caribbean Development Bank. Good morning, everyone. This series, as Mr. Best has said, reflects the commitment of the institution to supporting its borrowing member countries in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And as we all know now, the Sustainable Development Goals represent a commitment to address the challenges we face, whether that's poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, conflict, and insecurity of all types. I have to say that amongst the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, one of my favorites, if you can have a favorite, and I do, I have several favorites, but one of my favorites is Goal 16, which I think is very well aligned with this series. That goal speaks to the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies. The targets under Goal 16 address a range of issues, including the reduction of corruption, the development of effective and accountable and transparent institutions, ensuring participatory and representative decision-making, something very near and dear to your hearts, and ensuring public access to information and the protection of fundamental freedoms, something very dear to my heart. Simply, I would say there is a direct correlation between an engaged and informed and empowered citizenry and an effective parliament which provides oversight and holds the executive accountable for efficiency, for effectiveness, and indeed for prudent management of our scarce resources. The first webinar, as Mr. Best reminds us, examined financial oversight and the role of members of parliaments in monitoring and overseeing the executive. The second looked at how parliaments can use their lawmaking and oversight powers to advance pro-poor and gender-sensitive budgets. And this third and final webinar on public service ethos and a national integrity system, I love the title, looks at the parliamentary toolkit available to parliamentarians in fulfilling their key budgetary and financial oversight responsibilities. The concept of national integrity systems was in fact developed by Transparency International, and they define it as consisting of the key institutions, laws, and practices that contribute to integrity, transparency, and accountability in society. When it functions properly, the range of institutions that make up the system, it combats corruption as part of a larger struggle against abuse of power, malfeasance, and misappropriation in all forms. So today, in the course of our discussion with our participating parliamentarians, and Parliament is one of the key pillars of a national integrity system, the parliamentarians will identify other key pillars in the governance system, and they will discuss current performance in terms of promoting an effective national integrity system and a strong public service ethos. So how are we going to do it? We will start with our four panelists who will each speak for 6 minutes to some specific questions, which they have been advised of and are prepared for. And then we will open up to you, our audience in the virtual world, for your insights, comments, and questions, and of course, based on your experiences. So I wish to start now by introducing our first speaker, Senator the Honorable Olympia Williams Grant, who was first appointed as a senator to and elected as the president of the Upper House of Parliament in Antigua and Barbuda in June 2014. She was the youngest woman to hold the position at that time and was reappointed and re-elected in March 2018. Previously, she was a director of the board of directors of the Antigua Commercial Bank and the managing attorney at her civil law practice. The Honorable Williams Grant will be speaking to us for 6 minutes, and she will be sort of looking at two questions, defining what we mean when we say public service ethos, and then outlining for us her point of view on the characteristics that make up this public service ethos. Senator, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, for your kind acknowledgement and introductions this morning. Good morning to everyone. I'm very delighted to be able to participate in this learning experience with you today. I wish to extend heartfelt appreciation to the organizers for the invitation and commend them for their effort through these webinar series to better educate and equip us in respect of the service we have been called on to discharge. So as Madam Moderator would have indicated, I have been asked to speak on public service ethos. Now, hands up if when you first heard the term public service ethos, you had no clue what this was. Well, since I can't see you all raise your hands, I will raise mine on your behalf, because truthfully, I looked at it and I thought, oh, a new concept. And I was excited to immerse myself into this new realm of knowledge, only to realize that the terminology may have been new, but the concept advances key characteristics that should be embodied in any modern democracy for the basic preservation and support of the rule of law. That is, ensuring that there are systems in place to eliminate the misapplication, misappropriation of public funds while ensuring the best use of public resources. So the principles are consistent. However, the shift in focus was on the public service as a body and not just on us, the parliamentarians and politicians. The public service ethos is a defined set of principles or values that all public servants are expected to adhere to when performing their duties to the public. And what exactly are these values? Some research show that the key ones are accountability, community responsibility, integrity, and customer service. Research published in 2011 in the Journal of Public Administration, Research and Theory also identifies the values intrinsic to the public sector ethos as including commitment, impartiality, and some notion of the public interest as distinct from private interest. Now, these values are pretty much self-explanatory. The level of importance of each of these may vary from person to person and country to country. The focus for me, though, is their significance as it relates not just to my role and function as a legislator or to yours as a sitting minister or member of government, but how it impacts the general public's interest. A reasonable level of public interest is of fundamental importance to the proper functioning of our democracies, and the degree to which the public is prepared to trust government is strongly influenced by perceptions as to the general ethical standards of that government, particularly the executive. The public service ethos, therefore, enhances the transparency and accountability of policy making, administrative decision making, and government service delivery. In doing so, it removes the perception that people in public office are selfish, lazy, or driven by personal enrichment at the public's expense. The ethos promotes confidence in the process and builds that public trust, which is crucial for both governments and the people they govern. Now, former President of the United States of America, Woodrow Wilson, is credited with saying that government ought to be all outside and no inside. And everyone knows that corruption thrives in secret places and avoids public places. And we believe it's a fair presumption that secrecy means impropriety. That's his quotation. Now, a code of conduct for public servants, for instance, would make open to the public what are the overall responsibilities of public servants, explain further that public servants in carrying out their official duties ought to arrange their private affairs in a manner that will prevent real, apparent, or potential conflicts of interest from arising, would also make it known that if a conflict does arise between the private interest activities and the official duties, the conflict should be resolved in favor of the public interest. No officer, no public officer should hold a private investment that would interfere or conflict in any way with his or her duties to the service. And the public should also be able to check for measures that address breaches of such code. The public service ethos also serves to assist countries in developing a strong and robust national integrity system. And this basically means that effective and responsive institutions are functioning as strong checks and balances mechanisms developed through both law and administrative practice within the scope of the principle of separation of powers, in order to ensure that officials and government institutions act honestly, fairly, transparently, accountably, and diligently in the discharge of legitimate missions for which they have been entrusted with public power. It facilitates a robust governance system which is able to mitigate against corruption risk. This in turn would safeguard the public purse, that the public purse is properly applied and distributed in a manner approved and intended. The Latimer House principles promoted by the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association advances the position that as it relates to national institutions in ensuring that principles of good governance under the rule of law are properly and effectively addressed, effective mechanisms should be put in place, which should include the development of effective methods and systems of oversight, accountability, confidence building, and very importantly, for the inculcation of a culture of transparency, openness, and judicious use of public resources. So for instance, in Antigua and Barbuda, outside of the constitutional safeguards, such as the Ombudsman, the Director of Audit, and the Public Accounts Committee, which the next presenter will focus on, our national integrity system is also buttressed by our Integrity in Public Life Act, which establishes the Integrity Commission, which serves as the repository for declarations which must be filed annually of the affairs of persons holding specific positions in public life for the purpose of establishing probity, integrity, and accountability in public life. There's also the civil service regulations, which deals with recruitment, the tenure, the training, and the code of conduct, excerpts of which I shared with you previously, among other things relative to the public servants. The Prevention of Corruption Act, which is designed to do just as it says, prevent corruption, which is an offense, corruption by public officials while holding office or employed by a public body. The Freedom of Information Act, which promotes the maximum disclosure of information in the public interest and the right of access to that information. So public sector reform is a sensitive topic for most governments to address, except unless they're in opposition. Strengthening the integrity of the public sector and enhancing openness and accountability in our countries are fundamental to the political health of a modern state, and I dare say, central to a mature democracy. Thank you for the opportunity once again to contribute to the discussion, and I look forward to the exchanges later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Williams-Grant. You gave us a lot of food for thought, and I very much liked that you pointed to also the role of citizens and what it would require for them to have confidence in the system of integrity. I want to turn over now to Mr. Julian Robinson, who has been a member of Parliament, I understand, for the constituency of St. Andrews, Southeastern Jamaica since 2011. He is an opposition spokesman on finance, and he's the chair of the Parliament's Public Accounts Committee. Between 2012 and 2016, Mr. Robinson served as a Minister of State in the Ministry of Science, Technology, Energy, and Mining, and as General Secretary of the People's National Party from 2016 to 2020. Mr. Robinson, as I said, is currently the chair of the Public Accounts Committee of Jamaica, and he will be speaking this morning on his experience as chair and the strengths and weaknesses of the committee in terms of their ability to change behavior across government and in promoting better management of public money. Over to you, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Roberta. Good morning to my fellow panelists, and good morning to all the other persons who have joined us this morning. I want to start by just explaining how the PAC works, its composition, how matters are brought to the attention of the PAC, and then to deal with what I would consider some of the strengths and weaknesses and areas in which we can improve. First of all, we can only examine matters that are tabled in Parliament, generally by the Auditor General, who would go into a ministry, agency, or department and do an audit. Based on that, she tables it in Parliament, and once it's tabled in Parliament, then the Public Accounts Committee can interrogate the matter. The process that is normally employed is that after the Auditor General does her audit, she would invite the specific MD, ministry, department, or agency to respond to her audit findings. And so at the Public Accounts Committee, you would have the audit from the Auditor General, and you would have the specific agency with its response, which then allows the members of the PAC to interrogate both the report and the response from the agency. The composition of the PAC is determined by the balance of the two main parties within Parliament. So right now, in opposition, we only have 14 seats and the governing party has 49, which is about a ratio of close to 3.5 to 1. So it means on the Public Accounts Committee, of the 15 members, 12 are government members and 3 are opposition members, which includes me as the chair. So outside of me as the chair, there are only 2 opposition members who serve on the Public Accounts Committee. One of the challenges that we have found is that government members tend to be defensive, particularly where audits may find things which are embarrassing to them, and would, in a sense, almost play the role of akin to a defense lawyer in those sittings versus necessarily trying to interrogate and get to all the facts, because we have a very competitive political environment and nobody wants their side to be embarrassed or to be seen to be embarrassed. So we have had issues where members view their role from the perspective of the party that they're supporting, rather than a commitment totally to transparency and accountability in governance. I would say there are 2 main challenges that, or areas that I think can be improved. So we depend a lot on the Auditor General for her reports and her findings, etc. But the committee itself doesn't have any independent resources to assist us in assessing or evaluating these reports. Now, you have to imagine some of these reports are 60 pages, some of them are 100 pages, some of them are dealing with analysis of financial statements, transactions, which not all parliamentarians would have the experience or the expertise to decipher and to be in a position to make intelligent conclusions and to probe and ask the right kind of questions. So one area that I believe needs to be improved for all members and a resource available to the public.
But when Mr. Robinson gets back his connectivity, we will ask him to continue, because I think he reached the crux of what he wanted to say, which are the recommendations to strengthen the Accounts Committee's oversight. So with your permission, I think I will move on to the Honorable Gail Teixeira as we wait for Mr. Robinson to reconnect. The Honorable Gail Teixeira is a political scientist and a historian, and has been serving as a Member of Parliament in Guyana since 1992, and is presently the Minister of Parliamentary Affairs and Governance and Chief Whip of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Minister Teixeira has also served as Minister of Health, Minister of Culture, Youth and Sports, and Minister of Home Affairs. So a rather expansive portfolio with a lot of experience in public service. Honorable Gail Teixeira, I'm going to turn over to you for you to perhaps walk us through a bit of the differences in the Constitution of Guyana and highlight the key reforms being undertaken. And Mr. Robinson, we see you. We're going to come back to you after Ms. Teixeira for you to resume. I hope that that's okay with you. Over to you, Honorable Gail Teixeira.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Thank you. And good morning to all the attendees. Guyana has a number of unique features in its constitutional, legislative, national integrity framework. The constitutional reform process in 1999 to 2001 made major changes in entrenching transparency, accountability, rule of law, and inclusivity with regard to the scrutiny of public expenditure and assets of the state. First of all, and what may be of interest, the appointment of the Auditor General as a constitutional post equivalent to the level of a judge. And in the article, the 204, it is the President appoints on the recommendation of the Public Service Commission, which is also a constitutional body set up by a kind of power sharing arrangement between the government and the opposition. As well as Article 223, the Office of the Auditor General is a constitutional body, and the Auditor General is independent in the exercise of his functions under the Constitution. The Auditor General shall not be subject to the direction or control of any person or authority. The AG submits his report to the Speaker of the National Assembly, who shall cause them to be laid in the National Assembly and then referred to the PAC. Please note formally, this the Auditor General used to report to the Minister of Finance. This no longer happens. The Auditor General reports and audits on all public sector agencies, state corporations, foreign funded programs, and local authorities. The PAC may exercise general supervision over the functions of the Auditor General in accordance with the rules, policies, and procedural manuals prepared by the AG and approved by the PAC, but cannot interfere with the work of the Office of the Auditor General. The Auditor General can hire staff based on an organizational chart approved by the National Assembly, and the PAC can interview and approve the top tier of his management. Once the PAC has completed the review of an annual report to the AG, it submits its report and recommendations to the National Assembly. And once adopted, the Ministry of Finance has 90 days to issue a Treasury memorandum with regards to action taken in accordance with the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. The second relevant constitutional amendment was the provision for another constitutional post, the constitutional body, the Public Procurement Commission, Article 212W, with 5 articles dedicated to the PPC and its operations. The purpose of it is to monitor public procurement and to ensure that the procurement of goods, services, and execution of works are conducted in a fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective manner according to law and policies as may be determined by the National Assembly. The Commission shall be independent, impartial, and should discharge its functions fairly. The PPC consists of 5 members with expertise defined by the Constitution and appointed by the President after such members have been nominated by the Public Accounts Committee and approved by not less than 2/3 of the elected members of the National Assembly. And that's a very unique feature in Guyana, that there are a number of appointments of constitutional bodies that require 2/3 majority of the National Assembly, something not easy to achieve, I can assure you. The Procurement Act 2003 provides for the regulation of the procurement of goods, services, and execution of works to promote competition and to promote fairness and transparency in the public process. It details the procurement process for public, selective, single-source procurement, and procurement by community participation. This is particular and unique in Guyana to do with Amerindian communities being able to bid and participate in small projects. It provides also for the appointment of the National Procurement and Tender Administration Board, appointed by the Minister of Finance for 2 years, consisting of 7 members. 5, no more than 5 from the public service, and no more than 3 from the private sector after consulting with their representative organizations. The chair and 1 other is full-time and appointed by the minister. Each member shall declare their assets to the Integrity Commission. The NPTAB, or National Procurement Tender Administration Board, also appoints the tender boards at the ministerial, regional, and local authority levels, and also provides the pool of evaluators at those levels. When the PPC is appointed, the NPTAB reverts to exercising jurisdiction over tenders, appointing a pool of evaluators, and maintaining efficient records and quality assurance systems. The PPC plays a monitoring role of the procurement process, making regulations governing procurement under provisions of the Procurement Act, standard bidding documents, training in regards to procurement, and reporting annually to the minister on the effectiveness of the procurement process. It also investigates complaints and bid protests and adjudicates on department procedures. An unusual feature in the Procurement Act is Section 54(1), which provides for the Cabinet the right to review all procurement which exceeds the value of 15 million Guyana dollars, but it does not allow the Cabinet to have any authority to award a tender to any supplier or contractor. The Cabinet may object to an award of a procurement contract only if it determines that the procurement entity failed to comply with applicable procurement procedures, and that is referred back to the NPTAB to review and examine. If the NPTAB feels that the Cabinet is wrong, it can resubmit to Cabinet, and Cabinet has little choice in this regard. In the interest of transparency and ensuring there's a well-informed public, a number of administrative and legal innovations were created post-2003. And this has to do with using technology to be able to inform the public. The PAC, for example, in Guyana has public sessions when it is interviewing or questioning public entities that have been examined by the Office of the Auditor General. As thanks to COVID, these are now live streamed in terms of the public being able to witness any and hear the questions and the answers by any public entity being examined. The Office of the Auditor General has a website provided for in law where the Act and regulations and all the reports from 1970 to 2019 are presently accessible, including performance audit reports and compliance audits. The NPTAB website, nptab.gov.gy, also provided for in law, post minutes of tender openings, and you can see the tenders open from January 7th to 2020 to November 18, 2021. I should pause here to say that what is unusual in Guyana is that all opening of tenders are public, and the press is invited to witness the opening. You will see on the website as well, and this is what happens in the openings, the contract number, the name of the bidder, the description of the tender, the bid price, compliance with income tax, national insurance, insurance coverage. So the bidders and the public can see who are the bidders and the bid prices as well, and if they have submitted all the required documents. The website includes standard bidding documents for consultancies, goods, works, contracts awarded, and so you can see what contracts have been awarded that are publicly displayed, as well as all the manuals, guidelines, handbooks, standard evaluation criteria handbooks, guidelines for pre-qualification, and the NPTAB operation manual. So these are all public. As I said, the very interesting thing is that the opening of tenders in Guyana are open to the media and to the public. The PPC also has a website where it also is required to post investigative reports, and the website has not been updated recently, but it has 5 investigative reports based on letters of protest, one of which was written by me in 2017. In its efforts to ensure inclusion through an agreed on parliamentary consensual mechanism to appoint the PPC by requiring a 2/3 majority of the National Assembly, this has led to some rather political gridlock. And so between 2004 and 2017, there was no agreement between the government and opposition with regard to the 2/3, to achieve the 2/3. This was achieved in 2017 when the opposition, which I was in at that time, gave the support to the government on a 3-2 basis for the 2/3. Now that the PPC expired in 2019 and the National Assembly only recommenced meeting in September 2020 as a result of the delayed results of the election, the process has now recommenced in the PAC, and it will be interesting to see how and if the 2/3 majority will be achieved for its appointment this time round. So I just thought I would share with you some of the differences I believe exist in relation to the Guyana's national integrity system and the constitutional and legal requirements, and as well as some of the innovations. So I hope that will be useful to our viewers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Teixeira. Indeed, it seems like you have quite an architecture of
Yes.
accountability, and I think we can have some questions on that. Readjust. I would like to introduce Mr. Rick Stappenhurst, who is an assistant professor at the School of Continuing Studies at McGill University.
Sorry?
Where he oversees the professional development training program for members of parliament and for parliamentary staff, and he leads the university's parliamentary research program. Previously, he was director of parliamentary programs in the governance and anti-corruption unit at the World Bank Institute. He has worked with more than 60 parliaments across Africa and the world, wow, and has written extensively on issues related to financial oversight and parliamentary strengthening. Over to you, Mr. Stappenhurst, for your 6 minutes with us in your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam. Good. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about some of the research that we have done on parliamentary oversight and corruption. And I must say, it's a real challenge to follow such distinguished speakers, very relevant comments and insights that they had. So let's put this into presentation mode. All right. So I want to explain the concepts of oversight, parliamentary oversight. I want to consider why it's important, review some empirical findings, and highlight the role of the legislature. And in particular, I'll be drawing on some research that Anthony Stadden and I and others have done across the Caribbean and around the world. In particular, I want to bring two strands of research together that have been proceeding in parallel, and although there's obvious synergy, there is little crossover in the research that's actually been done by academics. And that is corruption on the one hand, and legislative or parliamentary oversight on the other. Thinking first of all about corruption, the research is quite clear that corruption hinders development. The research also shows that multifaceted strategies are required to combat corruption. There's not a single silver bullet. It's a multifaceted program that's required. One of the key components of an anti-corruption strategy is effective legislative oversight. But the corruption scholars spend very little time focusing on how legislative oversight is important and why. The legislative research, by contrast, has looked at how parliaments work, but tends not to focus on the impact of parliamentary work, and particularly of oversight. So a quick recap, we can think of three types of corruption. We can think of grand corruption. This is where large companies will pay a percentage of a project's value to those officials who make decisions on who wins the contract. There's bureaucratic corruption, which is petty corruption that happens at the day-to-day level of most people's lives. And there's legislative corruption, companies or interest groups that try to bribe members of parliament to pass legislation. Another recap, looking at parliaments, and I want to focus here on the part that's in purple. These are the parliamentary tools and mechanisms that are in parliament that can be used for parliamentary oversight, for holding the government to account. There's, of course, the committee system and particularly the Public Accounts Committee, which I'll come back to in a moment, party and party groups, what happens in the chamber, question period, debates and interpellations, special commissions of inquiry, in some parliaments, the review of official appointments, of executive appointments, and then outside of parliament, but has been suggested, the auditors general, the anti-corruption agencies, the ombuds offices, the integrity offices that often report to Parliament and strengthen parliamentary oversight. So thinking of these three types of corruption, bureaucratic, grand, and legislative, and I'm not going to go through all of this, you can read this afterwards, but each of these types of corruption have examples. For example, bureaucratic corruption, it might be when the policeman stops you for speeding, asks you to pay a fine to him or to her and not to the official agencies. Or it might be speed money to get things done quicker than they otherwise would. I've mentioned grand corruption. This is when private interests and companies try and capture the state for their own purposes. And legislative corruption, there might be influence peddling and embezzlement, for example. And the different parliamentary oversight tools on the right-hand side of this screen are the different mechanisms that can be used to combat the different types of corruption. And some mechanisms are useful across the board, and some are more specific. Committees, supreme audit institutions, anti-corruption agencies, all of those things that I've just mentioned on the previous slide. Except, and I'd like to highlight at the bottom, legislative codes of conduct in terms of making sure that members of Parliament are seen to be ethical and behaving in ethical ways. Now, the average person will say, well, why is all of this important? Does this make any difference? And this is where the research really, I think, shows a very strong correlation here. We're looking at parliamentary powers along the bottom index, and this is an index that was developed by two scholars at the University of California. And we're looking at the measure of corruption as measured by Transparency International. And you see a strong correlation here between those countries that have stronger parliamentary powers and particularly oversight, countries like Denmark, like the Czech Republic, like New Zealand and the Netherlands, where corruption is lower, and countries at the other end of the spectrum, like Ukraine, Algeria, and Belarus, where corruption is higher and parliamentary oversight is lower. The research findings, to summarize the research findings, as oversight increases, it becomes easier to scrutinize and control government. I think as parliamentarians, you will readily identify and agree with that. The more government is subject to control, the more likely it is for corruption to be reduced. In other words, a country has lower levels of corruption as parliamentary oversight increases. And not on the slide, but something I wanted to share with you. Across the world, when we look at 70 or 80 countries, and we look at oversight and we look at corruption, we find that 40% of the variation in the levels of corruption worldwide can be directly attributed to the effectiveness of parliamentary oversight. And within parliamentary oversight, an effective Public Accounts Committee is by far the most important parliamentary mechanism to help reduce corruption. And across the Caribbean, we see some very strong Public Accounts Committees, such as in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, and emerging now, I think, very strongly at Belize as well. In other countries, we see much weaker Public Accounts Committees. And the takeaway, I think, is to reduce corruption, Public Accounts Committees have to be adequately resourced and equipped to be able to undertake their duties as required by the Constitution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stappenhurst. I very much liked your continuum of corruption, and we're going to come back to that. This idea of grand corruption is also an intriguing concept. I would like to ask the organizers to stop sharing the screen, and also invite Mr. Robinson back in, and hopefully all things are sorted out to facilitate his presentation. Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I don't know where I left off. I think I was talking about the challenges faced by the...
Start from areas, right. Start from areas of concern. Yeah.
Well, what I said, first of all, in terms of the composition, it is based on the balance of the parties in Parliament, and where you have a lopsided Parliament, where we have now the ratio on the PAC is about 3-to-1, almost 4-to-1 of government to opposition members. So we have 15 members, 12 from the governing side and 3 from the opposition, including the chair. And so you can have cases where, particularly where matters arise that may be embarrassing to a government, that government members adopt a posture of being defensive around the issues versus interrogating the issues for wherever the issues may lie. And it's the nature of a very competitive two-party system that we have in Jamaica. The second area I highlighted was the need for the PAC to have its own independent resource to be able to analyze the reports that come to us and the responses from the ministries, agencies, and department. So the Auditor General would do her report. It comes to us. Now, many of these reports are very lengthy. They would contain financial matters that some MPs, based on their own experiences, would be able to do the analysis and decipher and ask the appropriate questions. But I do believe it would strengthen the capacity of the PAC if we had a resource that could support the committee independent of what an Auditor General would provide. So to even be in a position to interrogate the Auditor General's own assessment and own report of that ministry, agency, and department. And the third area that I believe is an area that can be improved. Once the Auditor General does her report, which is tabled in Parliament, we can examine it. But the practice is you wait on the ministry, agency, and department to respond to the Auditor General's findings formally, and then you invite both the Auditor General and that specific department. Right now, there is no specific timeline around which a ministry, agency, and department has to respond to. So you could have a situation where the work of the PAC is frustrated because a ministry, agency, or department is tardy in responding to the Auditor General's own findings. I also believe we have to look at making some of the recommendations binding coming out of a PAC. So, for example, a PAC will examine an Auditor General's report. It has a sitting, 2 sittings, 3 or 4. It comes up with recommendations which are made. There is no real institution that exists to ensure that those recommendations are followed up. And unfortunately, what we have seen is that in some of these ministries, agencies, and departments, issues which arose in our report 2 years ago come back up again, because unless the Auditor General goes back in to do an audit, the recommendations which should be implemented are not necessarily done. So I think that's also an area that I believe we can strengthen and improve to ensure that those recommendations are followed. And also, I think the Auditor General needs more resources, because having done an audit, it's also important for her to be in a position to indicate where the specific actions have been taken. And that area needs to, in my view, needs to be strengthened. The greatest asset I believe the PAC has is what I would call the public scrutiny, which once we meet, all our meetings are open to the public. And I do believe it's an important barometer for ensuring accountability and transparency. There's no civil servant or public servant wants to come to a PAC and be hauled up for breaches and not following guidelines. And I think it has acted in a positive way to bring some compliance with some of the issues that the Auditor General would raise. But as I said, the one weakness is where there are egregious breaches that require correction. The Auditor General can refer matters, for example, to our Integrity Commission or even to the police. But there are a lot of areas where administrative breaches arise, and I believe there's more that can be done to ensure that those recommendations are followed. So I would say in summary, having a strong independent Auditor General, which we do have, is important to the proper functioning of the Public Accounts Committee, but there are areas of the additional support that would add and strengthen the Public Accounts Committee and make it more effective as a body. So those are my comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robinson. Really, I think it's been a little bit frustrating for you, but I think you made all of your points and we heard them clearly right down to the very end. And the strongest recommendation is to increase the capacity of the Auditor General, not only to do the investigation, but also to do the follow-up. And also the idea of the greatest asset being the public scrutiny, which I think was also a point made by Minister Teixeira when she spoke about all the processes, the architecture in Guyana, where all these processes are open to the public. So really strong points, and they align with each other. I want to say we have, I think, remaining 15 more minutes. And before I do any wrap up or summary, I would like to invite the participants. There are now about 57 people online. I would like to invite anyone who wishes to ask a question to do so either in the chat, or you can also do so by speaking. I understand that the Deputy Speaker of St. Lucia, Mr. Jeremiah Norbert, is with us, and he has a question for you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Norbert, can you unmute or be unmuted and ask your question? Organizers, can you help Mr. Norbert?
I believe he's having some difficulty. So may I just read out the question, please?
Please do so.
Mr. Julian Robinson, parliamentarians come from various backgrounds and walks of life, and some have little to no experience as it relates to dealing with audits or finance. And the law is such that parliamentarians chair and sit on the PAC. How can we trust the competency of people who are tasked with reviewing audits to make quality recommendations?
Well, I actually made that very point, that I think that's one of the areas that need to be improved. The capacity of members to do the proper analysis, to go through a 100-page report and determine what the key salient points are. And that's why in what I said, I do believe certainly for us here in Jamaica, we would benefit from having an independent resource apart from the Auditor General who could provide that support to the PAC. As he rightly mentioned, some persons may come from a background where they do have experience in that area, but the assumption should be made that most won't. And I would say in practice, most persons who sit on the PAC don't have that background. So the support of that resource, I believe, would strengthen the PACs and make them more effective. So I support I concur with the concern, and it supports the recommendation that I have made, actually.
Can I come in here?
Please do.
Yes, just to add to what Mr. Robinson has said, is that the Parliament Office of Guyana is a constitutional body with its own independent resources, and they are required to share their technical people with all members of the PAC, with no discrimination regarding the technical support to the members of the PAC. Furthermore, I noticed Mr. Robinson talked about the unequal or uneven representation based on seats acquired. In our Parliament, the standing orders make it clear the government has 5 and the opposition has 4, but the chair is always the opposition. And so that is our standing orders, which cannot be deviated at all. So in terms of resources, we always need resources, obviously. The other thing is that I think the Caribbean in particular, Madam Clerk, is that our parliaments are not full-time parliaments. Our parliamentarians are part-time. They are lawyers, doctors, nurses, public servants, housewives, whatever is available, because we're elected by our people. And therefore, not having a full-time member of parliament puts strains even when they have persons who have expertise or who have the quality. So the parliamentarians, I think, in our parliament, despite the point Mr. Robinson makes, actually do a tremendous amount of work with boxes of files that we're given and the electronic and use of electronic means to go through. So I just wanted to comment on that as one that affects and one could help.
Thank you very much, Minister Tishara. I will, Mr. Stephenhurst, I'll come back to you because we have Speaker Philbert from Jamaica who wishes to ask a question, and I will come back to Honorable Williams Grant and yourself as first response. Go ahead, Speaker Philbert from Jamaica. Or maybe someone can ask.
Our representative was excellent. Can you hear me? Was
very
good,
well.
and indeed what he said is important. We do need support for our members of the PAC in examining the Auditor General's thing. But I know that he said, and I just want to say for the Honorable Texira from Ghana, our numbers are based on the members that are elected in an election. So that is why we have an imbalance. But I know that Member Robinson will agree that although there's an imbalance, we still have robust discussions. And in fact, there are occasions, yes, it is true that we do sometimes on the government side, it does look sometimes if there's something that we act as defense lawyers, but there are occasions when our members do get together on points in the interest of our country. So I really want to say that our PAC does do an excellent job. We work together and they are extremely robust in our discussions here in Jamaica.
Thank you very much, Speaker Philbert. I propose to take a few more comments and then I will ask the panel to have a round of responses, starting with Honorable Williams Grant and Mr. Stephenhurst. So queue, I see the Member of Parliament from Guyana, Ms. Tabitha Sarabo Haley, and then followed by Alison West. Can you please go ahead, Ms. Haley? Can she be unmuted? And then followed by the Minister of Public Administration, Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Haley?
It would be good if she unmuted herself.
Okay. Whilst maybe that's
Good
happening.
morning. I posted a question in the chat, but I don't mind putting it back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The question is for Mr. Robinson. There obviously is a stark difference between the number of opposition government members in your parliament and on your Public Accounts Committee. I'm just wondering, as chair of the PAC, can you say under what circumstances the chair of the PAC can be removed and who has the right to remove the chair of the Public Accounts Committee?
I don't know if I know the answer to that. I mean, the standing orders indicate that the opposition would chair it, and traditionally it's the opposition spokesman on finance, and I'm currently the person who sits in that position. I must confess, I'm not sure on what terms a chair could be removed. That's something that I would have to look in our standing orders to determine. But I would say if the individual vacates that position, it would still be someone from the opposition who would still chair the committee. So even if the person changes, as in my case, the previous chair of the PAC, who was the former spokesman on finance, is now the opposition leader. And I assumed that role after he was elevated to opposition leader. So even if the personality changes, it would still be a member of the opposition that would chair the committee.
Thank you for that. Minister of Public Administration, Minister West, can you ask your question or make your comment?
I would just like to first commend all the panelists for very excellent contributions. I was wondering, as Mr. Staphenhurst was speaking, whether the countries that he indicated were more had more robust systems of oversight, whether there was less corruption there because of the oversight, or whether the countries were more evolved and therefore more inclined to be less involved in corruption than the others who were less so. So does the system fix the problem, or is the system created because there's less of a problem?
Thank you very much, Minister. So we'll have a last round of responses from the panelists before we wrap up, and I want to start with Honorable Alincia Williams-Grant. Anything you want to say to any of the comments or queries that have been asked? Over to you.
Thank you, Roberta. I think I just needed to comment on the issue of the capacity of the membership of the PAC. Oftentimes, and as the member from Ghana, Honorable Teixeira, mentioned, we are mostly part-time, full-time parliamentarians, and it is a challenge. But I think coming into a role with such burden and such responsibility, that we owe ourselves the opportunity to engage in understanding and tooling ourselves to appreciate the discharge of our functions. And two, that the structure, the construct of our respective parliaments should facilitate training. So, I mean, if I'm looking to appoint members to a committee, unless it specifically states, for instance, that the chair must be the opposition leader or the person responsible for financial, the financial spokesperson for the opposition, the other members of the committees should have some measure of understanding or exposure to the issues that they will be dealing with. And if not, it behoves the speaker, the clerk, the structure of the parliament should facilitate them getting the requisite training to appreciate the job function. I know our small parliaments in particular, Antigua and Barbuda, we are challenged by the financial resources commitment shortages. And so it's very challenging. And what I've found is that our members put themselves out to try to get that capacity, get that better understanding. It might not be as full and as complete as we would like it to be, but I think we have a responsibility as legislators to do more than just say, I don't know anything about this. That is what I wanted to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Staphenhurst.
Thank you. And look, rather a shotgun scattered list of comments here. One of the things that I think could really help the smaller Caribbean legislatures and public accounts committees is to do what many of the Pacific and some of the British Islands are doing, and that's appointing lay members to beef up the committee's resources. So you have one or two or more non-members of parliament who might be accountants or economists or whatever supporting the committee. In terms of resources, again, for the smaller states where parliamentary staff are limited, perhaps some thought could be given to hiring interns from the local college to work on the committee. What a great experience for a young student to have than to do research for the Public Accounts Committee. One of the problems that was mentioned as a problem is follow-up. I think Honourable Robinson mentioned this, the follow-up to what the Public Accounts Committee does. Too often the government can just ignore the recommendations. Some countries have appointed a Government Assurances Committee, and that committee, chaired by a member of the opposition, follows up on all the promises that government says. Two more comments. What happens in those small jurisdictions where there are insufficient opposition members to be on the Public Accounts Committee? In Grenada, when I was doing research in Grenada a few years ago, every elected member of parliament was from the governing party. What does one do then? Perhaps consideration could be given, as was done in Grenada at that time. Look to the senators, look to the upper chamber to beef up the membership of the committee. And finally, the question that was directed to me, of course, corruption is a very complex issue. But when we did our statistical analysis, we did allow for levels of national income, levels of development, and so on, and holding all of those, taking all of those other factors into account, population, country size, and so on, taking all of those into account, we still find that the key issue in reducing corruption is effective parliamentary oversight and effective public accounts committees.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stappenhurst. I now turn over to Minister Teixeira. Any responses? And then followed by Mr. Robinson.
Well, thank you very much again, Madam Clerk. It's been an interesting experience hearing about our other Caribbean countries, and from Mr. Stappenhurst, I hope I've said his name right. I think that the number of rules of thumb, we have a good architecture in Guyana. However, there are challenges. One is that we try to build in a balance between the government and opposition, a kind of power sharing kind of mechanism. However, with the best intentions, this is extremely difficult to implement. And so, for example, as I said, where some of these issues require 2/3 majority, some of these things take years. So in fact, in some of our architecture, there is political gridlock, because we're dealing with human factors and not the law and the constitution. The standing orders of Guyana have gone through a number of revisions. And when I listened to Mr. Robinson from Jamaica, we have gone through 2 revisions in the last 20 years of our standing orders by sending it to select committees where they're gone through point by point, and therefore the insistence on certain committees and the numbers are critical. One of the things that haven't been mentioned in this webinar, which I think is part of the governance and the anti-corruption oversight, which I think we should mention. I don't put much credence on Transparency International, regrettably, but most of us in the Caribbean member states, we have ratified the UN Convention Against Corruption and the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. These are based on what are standard procedures and analyses in regards to how well we're doing in the anti-corruption and the national integrity frameworks that are governed by international law. All of our countries try in various levels to try to achieve, to show progress. And therefore, I think that we should be measured against the kind of progress that we make in those, based on those international conventions rather than on TI. The point for us as a region is that I look at the statistics about the developed world and corruption and the undeveloped world, or the developing world with corruption, and I feel sad, because I think that there has been a lot of attempts by developing countries, including countries in this region, to try to improve the anti-corruption mechanisms. I think that our challenges are enforcement, our challenges are in terms of implementation, our challenges are in relation to resources and to the technical skills that sometimes in some countries have been exported to other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So I just want to close on that before I get rattled and I go on and on. Thank you.
Yes, that's a good reminder of all the things that I think Mr. Robinson fully agree with you about the enforcement and implementation. He spoke quite a bit about it. Over to you, Mr. Robinson.
I would just summarize by saying, you know, certainly here in Jamaica, we have a strong public accounts committee. There are constraints, which I've mentioned, in terms of having an independent resource to help. We're also, you know, the Auditor General, with the best will in the world, would need more resources to do more audits, because we can't view a matter unless it is audited and then tabled in the Parliament. So we are restricted in a sense by that, which is not an issue, but the Auditor General has that constraint. So I believe additional support to a PAC, being in a position to follow up on recommendations that are made, are very important steps in enhancing the level of accountability. As I mentioned, I believe the public nature of the PAC, the fact that once a report is tabled in Parliament, is public, it's on the Parliament's website, it can be viewed by everybody. That level of transparency, I think, contributes to persons acting in a more appropriate way, consistent with good principles of accountability and transparency.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know we are 11:18, so 3 minutes over our time. But I am aware that the speaker from Belize wants to make a comment, and with your permission, panelists, we can maybe take another 10 minutes. Over to you, speaker from Belize. Speaker Wood,
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. I actually put the question in the chat, thinking that I didn't have enough time, but I believe Mr. Stappenhurst may have addressed it. I was asking the members on the panel from the Caribbean for your parliaments if there's any provisions in your standing orders that allow for your Public Accounts Committee to invite laypersons or experts to assist in the analysis or review of the Auditor General report.
Yes, that's an excellent question. I myself was wondering, would that require legislative amendments to have interns and laypersons on the PAC? And then also what the parliamentarians thought about that.
I would need to check what our standing orders say. I don't think there would be any issue with someone externally providing support to the parliamentarians. Whether they would sit in on a PAC, I think that's a different matter. But I do think Parliament would have the flexibility to say, here is a retired accountant who can help you analyze the financial statements. Because right now, we have another committee, which is called the Public Administration and Accountability Committee, which has a resource which helps that committee. So we do have a precedent, and that person doesn't sit when the committee is sitting in Parliament, but provides support to the members outside.
Mr. Stappenhurst, I don't know if you answered the question by the Minister of Public Administration when she asked, is this the correlation between strong institutions and reduced corruption? Is that about a development stage, access to resources more generally?
I thought I had, but let me explain it another way. And that is, yes, we do find, of course, that generally speaking, and there are many exceptions, the wealthier a country is, the more, I hate to use the terminology, developed a country is, the lower the level of corruption, but that's not always the case. We find, for example, that, and again, we could talk about Transparency International, and as somebody said to me, look, you're using Transparency International, it's a flawed index, but the problem is we don't have anything else. And to the extent that we do have other measures of corruption, they are very highly correlated. So, but let's use that for argument's sake right now. Countries that are more developed do have lower levels of corruption on the TI index. But some of the countries, some of the European countries, rank lower than some of the Caribbean countries. So it's not always related. But in the analysis that we did, we allowed for that. We took away the influence of the level of development or the size of the national income, and then did our analysis. So even allowing for differences in development, taking all of that out, we still found a very strong causal relationship.
Thank you. And I just have to say, we have one last person who wishes to speak, and it's also Speaker Anna St. George from Trinidad and Tobago. And Speaker Anna St. George, you will be the last person to make an intervention having regard to our time. Can you please go ahead, and then finally the panelists may respond to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Roberta. It was more comment in response to what was asked by Speaker Woods, but I'm using a mobile device, so it was limited with respect to how do I join the chat, but it is really a comment. Very good discussion to all the panelists. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And it is for me then to say thank you to the panelists, to thank you for your presentations. I think this is something that requires a lot more time than the hour and 15 minutes that was allocated to it. And I think Mr. Teixeira has been saying that from the very beginning. I wanted to just end by saying one of the things that I heard on the Honorable Olympia Williams-Grant say, and you said it, it's about public service, it's about ending corruption, but essentially what we're talking about there is improving the delivery of services to people. And you cannot improve delivery of services to people if the resources of the state are being captured for private interests. And this is where all of this connects. And the parliamentarians then, as the representatives of the people, have a duty, have an obligation to make sure that that capture is not happening, and if it is happening, that there is recourse and that there is redress. So I think it was an excellent presentation. I like the continuum of corruption presented by Rick, bureaucratic and executive, which is grand, by the way. That's a little bit chilling. And of course, the question of influence peddling, which can happen by parliamentarians. And the architecture for transparency and integrity in public life that was explained by Minister Teixeira of Guyana, a very robust constitutional arrangement, but also by Mr. Robinson in Jamaica. And critical to all of that, it seems to me, is the public scrutiny, the availability of the public to see what the PACs are doing and to be engaged in it. Now, my question as someone from civil society, do we know that the PACs hearings are open and available to us? And how can that be made much more accessible so that we can participate, or we can listen in, not participate, but listen in? And finally, I just want to repeat some of the recommendations that I heard you all speak to. And I think one that was recurring across all of the presentations was the importance of improving the capacity of the public accounts committees with experience and expertise, persons to help parliamentarians, particularly in small countries where you may have, as in Grenada, one party sort of having all of the seats, or in Antigua and Barbuda, or in Barbados, where you have a very big majority parliament from one party. So this idea of improving the capacity, whether you improve it through bringing in expertise, through internships, there's a range of things I suppose that can be done, but what do you need to do that? Do you need legislative change? But, you know, practical suggestions, I think, important. And this idea of having greater more capacity also of the other pillars of national integrity systems, including the Auditor General. We didn't hear much about the Ombudsman today, but that's also a really important institution. I think in Jamaica it's called the Public Defender, which is a fantastic term for what an Ombudsman does. So we do have that. It was really interesting to hear that we have some good experiences of public accountability in the Caribbean from Mr. Stappenhurst, and he said very clearly there's a clear correlation between strong public accounts committees and how they function and the reduction of corruption. So I think we have our marching orders there as we take to heart his research. And finally, this whole question of follow-up. How do we follow up and how do we enforce? And that's not just the Public Accounts Committee, but how do we link people, communities to that task of ensuring the enforcement of the oversight of the recommendations of the oversight. In the end, it comes down to that: how engaged are our publics in this endeavor of maintaining accountability and scrutiny and corruption? And if the public is disengaged because the public doesn't trust, there are any number of reasons, and I think the word trust was used by Honorable Williams Grant. It's down to trust. And if you have systems that are broken down, as we have in our Caribbean, a lot of polarization in our politics, the trust is already fractured from the beginning. How do we address the question of building trust so that we don't have, we don't have that level of defensiveness that may characterize some of our Public Account Committee deliberations? So I want to thank everyone for this really wonderful conversation. I want to thank the Caribbean Development Bank. Yes?
Sorry, Roberta. I need to intervene because the Speaker of the House in Guyana had his hand up for some time and wanted to make a contribution. So apologies to
Please
him.
go ahead, Mr. Speaker. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't see any hands up in this go-to webinar, unlike in Zoom. Please go ahead, Speaker from Guyana. You will have
Thank you very much. Let me just say, first of all,
yes.
Congrats to everyone. I sent my comment in the box so we can share that on. Thank you. Don't want to delay anyone. Thank you very much.
Christine, do you want at least just to
Hello?
speak to the comment, just say what the comment says? Thank you, Speaker. We can't see the box, but someone may help us.
Okay, basically I said,
yeah, please go. Please go ahead.
Basically, I said that a persons nominated to the PAC should come with some skills. We know there are anomalies in parliaments where one party has all the seats, where some parties have limited numbers of MPs. But basically, people should be nominated to the PAC with skills. I am not underemphasizing the parliamentary responsibility for training, but we must start with some skills.
Thank you. I think that everyone is nodding their head, but I suppose there are practical limitations in the kinds of experience that you have in any parliament, which I think Mr. Robinson has already addressed. But excellent reminder that all of us who are engaged in public life have a responsibility to develop ourselves as well, so that we can engage more fruitfully in the public scrutiny. So I want to close now. I want to thank everyone. We still have 56 people online with us. I want to thank the panelists, the Honorable Olympia Williams Grant, Mr. Julian Robinson, Minister Teixeira, and Mr. Stappenhurst for giving us their time, their thought, their talents, and of course their public service. I want to thank the Caribbean Development Bank for arranging this and giving us all the opportunity to have this exchange with parliamentarians as we seek to always, which we always need to do, improve our accountability or transparency in the interest of the public. I'm told to advise everyone you will be receiving after this, shortly after this, a letter, an email from the CDB, which will include a link to the recording for the session, as well as a survey. I think that survey is to give some response to some quite key questions, which have to do with how you have, what you've gained from these three sessions. So with that, I would like to bring the webinar to an end, and thank you very much for your engagement.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the